Welcome, and Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so we are doing Torah Mima, and in the Lech Lecha, Parsha Lech Lecha, where Abraham is commissioned by God to go to a land that he will show him. He does arrive in that land, and immediately there's a famine, a very heavy famine. Right? Vayirav ba'aretz, there was a famine in the land. Vayerid Avram Mitzrayma, and Abraham went down. By the way, there's that idea of Aliyah, going up to the land, Vayerid going down, right? Yerida. Mitzrayma, to Mitzrayim, to Egypt. Lagur Sham, we said this. Lagur is to take up a temporary residency there. Ki chaved hara'av ba'aretz, because the land was very, very tough in the land. And we'll take a look at it. So, little grammatical note that is mentioned in the, let's see, the source. Yeah, Yevamot, in Tractate Yevamot. So in the Talmud, Mitzrayim, right? So there's that. Mitzrayim, of course, is the word for Egypt. Mitzrayim means to Egypt. But if you have a basic knowledge, you know that in general, Hebrew uses prefixes to indicate those particular prepositions. So le Mitzrayim would be the normal way to say it. Le Mitzrayim. But Mitzrayim, okay, is also, it's the same way. And at least to my ears, it sounds more poetic. At any rate, Tanya. So Tanya means, of course, that it's a very early source. It's a Tanaitic source, which means it's mentioned in rabbinic sources prior to the close of the Mishnah, prior to the year 200. It's an early source. And the person is a Tana. The rabbi of that period is known as a Tana, a teacher. It's another word for teacher. Rabbi Nehemiah, Omer. So we attribute this to Rabbi Nehemiah. By the way, I'm sure I've mentioned this before, but we notice that so many of these sources have attributions. There certainly are anonymous sources, but so many of them have attributions. And I think there is an agenda going on here, probably more than one. But I think a great agenda is that it says, there's a statement that says, I believe this is in the Pirkei Avot, that says, when you attribute a statement to its author, you bring about salvation. Salvation. And the reason is it mentions in the Megillah that when Esther reported to King Achashverosh what was going on, I believe in the fact that there was this plan to assassinate. I could be wrong about this, but maybe I'm wrong. It could be about what Haman wanted to do. Forgive me, my poor memory. But she reported in the name of Mordechai. So I'm going to guess it's one or the other, but that Esther reported it to Achashverosh in the name of her uncle, her husband, however you want to say it, Mordechai. And there was salvation for the Jews. And from this, they extrapolate a general statement that when you attribute the statement to its author, you bring salvation. Amazing. And so, in a way, there's a sort of built-in echo of salvation in the studies and the works of the rabbis. So here we go. Rabbi Nehemiah Omer, Rabbi Nehemiah says, Kol teva, any word, shetzricha lamed betchilata, that requires a lamed at its beginning. And as I explained already, normally you would say le Mitzrayim, right? So we mean he went to, and le is to Egypt. So betchilata, at its beginning, hatel la hakatuf, hey besofa. The scripture placed a hey at the end of it to mean the same, right? Kagon, for example, Mitzrayim, right? The word Mitzrayim. Instead of le Mitzrayim, it says Mitzrayma. So it's in some senses, a grammatical note, right? He doesn't explain any deeper meaning as to why. It is, as far as we can be concerned right now, it is simply a stylistic issue. But I always suspect there are deeper meanings to these sorts of things, at any rate. And of course, well, if I were to play around with it, just mess around a little bit, we know that hey is a representative of hey, the letter hey represents God's presence, etc. The letter hey represents this reality. There's that wonderful, wonderful statement that this world was created with a hey. Why? Because if you look at the hay, you notice that it's empty at the bottom, and that's because it's so easy to drop out of this world that if you make bad choices, you allow your Yetzer Hara to speak to you and control you, you drop out of the world. But on the other hand, there's that little space here where you can crawl back in again. In other words, that tshuva, right? It's always possible to do tshuva in this world. So that's why the letter A represents this world, this particular world. So maybe, maybe it's saying that, when he went to Mitzrayim, God was still with him, even though he had left. I'm playing around. There's nothing necessarily compelling about this explanation, but just a thought that there might be a deeper meaning to this. Let's take a look at what Torah Tamima has to say. Not very much, really, right? Just from year to year. Ien Mashikatavti Sof Parshat Teitzei, right? He says, look at what we have written at the end of Parshat Teitzei, Ki Teitzah. We're going to have to wait until we get to the book of Deuteronomy and towards the end of the book of Deuteronomy, right? But Pasuk Lo Tieh Eshet Hamet Hachutza, that this has to do, it says the wife, right, of the deceased person shall not be cast out. And there's the word. In other words, instead of saying lachutz, it says hachutza. Right, so there's that hey at the end there. Mashinogea, what is concerning miklal ze ledina, what this, in other words, I'm going to have to guess. I looked up Ladina, couldn't find a satisfactory translation of this particular expression. I'm going to guess, Cloud there, this general principle, right, this general rule that we just had, Ladina, I think it would mean its applications. How does it get applied? So it's possible. I didn't check up Ki Teitze. Maybe there he discusses the deeper meanings, possibly, but I think there he's going to go into detail, he says, in that parsha about this particular rule. So maybe in my free time, I will check it out and see what he has to say and see if it's something we might be interested in. Let's go on to this one. This one is amazing. I am familiar with this particular one, but what he has to say about it is, or Torah Mima has to say about it, I thought was just really super, super. Anyway, hope you think so too. So, of course, he's about to go to Egypt, and Abraham knows, right, that there could be problems, right? So let's take a look at what's going on here. Vahi kasher hikriv lavo Mitzrayma, right? And it so happened that as they approached Egypt, they got close to come to Egypt, literally, and there's that Mitzrayma again to Egypt. Vayomer el Sarai ishto, he said to Sarah, his wife, Abraham said to Sarah, Hine, right? Hine, behold, see, something like that. Hine na, see, please. Yadati, I understand. I know. Ki isha yefat mar'eh, that you are a woman of beautiful vision. You're a beautiful lady. You're a beautiful woman. And of course, those who are familiar with the story at all know that going into Egypt and Pharaoh being such a, like practically treated like a god. If he cast eyes on a beautiful woman and he desired her, well, they'd kill the husband, and sort of variation of lex prima noctis, these kinds of things. Terrible. But anyway, he says, Hine yadati. Behold, I know. Mikan, we learn from this, to Avraham, right, that with regards to Abraham, filu bedidei lo istakil, right, that he never really looked at her. That up to this point, he never looked at her in a way that he would have said, "You're a beautiful woman." That this was the first time he realized just how beautiful she was. He'd never really looked at her up to this point. Remarkable. I mean, this itself is remarkable, right? Shinema, how do we know this? Hinena, behold, please, yadati, I understand, ki isha yafat mareat, that you are a woman who is beautiful. Miklal, right? And from this we infer, de me'ikara, that prior to this, lo heveyadala, he didn't realize this. He wasn't aware of it. Wow. Okay. Well, this is screaming for an explanation, all right? Sorry, here we go. Lo nitba'er hechreach hadracha. It doesn't explain the logic of this interpretation. How does it, how does it work? How do you say such a thing? Why would we say this from what we just read, right? It says we infer this. On what basis? Right, so Daha, because indeed, lo ketiv ataya dati, it doesn't say now I know. Now I know we'd say this for sure. He hadn't realized it prior to that. But it just says, behold, right? See. For adraba, and in fact, just the reverse. Pashtut halashon, if you look at the simple basis of this language, if you read this sentence, right? Hine nayadati, right? The fact that it says, see, now, see, I know, right? Mashma, it implies, yadati mikvar, I've known already, I'm aware of it. In other words, as if Abraham is saying to Sarah, I'm aware that you are a beautiful woman, right? I've known this for a long time. I've always felt that way. But it appears the tam hadiyuk, that the reason for this interpretation, this looking at it in this very specific kind of way, right? Humilashon hine. It comes from the expression hine, hine. That's the part that gives us this inference. Excuse me. Let's go on here. Let me find it. Have I got the right place? Looks like yep. Okay. Here we are. For Alpi Masha Katuv Rashbam, and we can base this on what the Rashbam wrote. Rashbam is the grandson, one of the Tosafists. He is Rashi's grandson, and he wrote a wonderful, wonderful commentary on the Torah, which basically the basis of his interpretation is the pshat. He really tries to understand the pshat meaning and explore the pshat meaning of the Torah and to examine it very carefully as to what the pshat meaning is. But Parshat Vayetze, right? In the Parsha of Vayetze. Vayetze, of course, is Genesis chapter 29, verse 25. Veze Lashonah. This is his language. Quote, in other words, we're going to quote him. Bechol davar, in any matter, shelo nodat chila, when one wasn't aware of it initially, omer vehine. Scripture uses the introduction of vehine, meaning that prior to that moment, it wasn't something that the person knew. So that the implication of the word behold means, aha, didn't know that before. Aha. Well, there we go, right? Ad kan lishonah. That's the end of his quote. Uve'emet, and truthfully, kain morin har psukim. There are many verses that make that suggestion. They have that meaning. In other words, we have to say that's exactly what it means. Kamor, and he's going to give an example. Vehine to'amim bevitna, right? That when Esau and Jacob are conceived, we see that they are twins. I think this is what it's referring to, right? That they are twins in her womb. So there's one example. Vehine. They didn't realize it up until that moment. Now they realize she has twins in her womb. She's pregnant with twins. Another example, Vayikatz Paro, says Pharaoh awoke, Vehine Chalom, and behold, it was a dream, right? This is the famous passage about the dreams of Pharaoh, which Joseph interpreted. Shelo nodalo, the point about this is he didn't realize he was dreaming, ad shehikitz michnato, until he woke up from his dream. V'chein dar chazal chama makomot. And this is in fact how our sages understand it in a number of places. Kemo, for example, the Megillah, this is the tractate Megillah, page 13b, al hapasuk, regarding the verse, v'hinei hi leah. Remember, after Laban tricks Jacob, and Leah is substituted for Rachel, right? It says in the morning, v'hinei hi leah, and behold, she was Leah. Miklal, that implies the ad hashta, that up to that moment, love Leahi. They go to the extent of saying that, and behold, she was Leah, that up to that moment, it wasn't Leah. It wasn't Leah. Ye'uyan Sham. Check it out. Ulefanenu b'parshat Vayetze, right? And be ahead of us in the Parsha Vayetze that we mentioned. Interesting. This is in Parshat Vayetze where we find this. V'chein peirashnu, and so we have explained al pi klal zeh, right? According to this general rule, drasha nifla'ah, right? An amazing interpretation. Berosh Parshat Tavo, at the beginning of Parsha Ki Tavo, in the book of Deuteronomy. But Pasuk Hine Heveti, look at that, right? Where you make that declaration. That's at the beginning of Parshat Ki Tavo. It talks about the Bikurim and how you come to Jerusalem and how the person is to bring his Bikurim and make this declaration. And it says in that declaration, Hine Heveti, behold, I have brought. Umevu arsham lefanenu, and there it will be explained before us. The pasuk in the verse, Higadati hayom, I declare today, v'chein yitba'er, and so it will be clarified, al pizeh, according to this, kavanat I think this is a midrash rabbah, right? The intention of the midrash rabbah, the parshat Bereshit, right? In the parsha of Bereshit in Genesis. Vayar Elohim et kol asher asa. There at the end of the creation story, that the chapter 1, it says Elohim saw, Vayar Elohim et kol asher asa. He saw all that he had made. Vehine, there it is. There's the hine. Tov ma'od. It was very good. Melamed, this is beautiful, by the way. Melamed, this implies Shahaya HaKadosh Baruch Hu Boneh Olamot. So how do we understand this? If we say, well, this means up to this point it wasn't this way, right? He saw for the first time, right? That the Holy One, blessed be He, Boneh Olamot Umacharivan, that He created universes or words and destroyed them. Boneh Olamot Machrivan, created universes and destroyed them. Ad shebara et elu, until he created these of Maaseh Breshit in Genesis chapter 1. Va'amar, and at that point he thought, right, or said, Dein hanayan, okay, these please me, hanayan li, they give me pleasure. V'dein lo hanayan li, but those do not give me pleasure. Okay, before I go on, to me, this is the worlds of the dinosaurs and the various billions of years until we got to this last little time. And that's to tell you that, of course, that we're not suggesting that the year of 5,785 going on to 5,786 is actually, even though it says the creation of the world, it's talking about the world of Torah. In other words, a world essentially in which people have some sense of righteousness, and it's not just following your instincts. And so essentially also that is how far back history goes. And that's why we talk about prehistoric time. That in terms of because the whole notion of a historical process is different from the natural processes that we talk about, or even, I studied this in philosophy, mythical time, right? The consciousness of mythical man was essentially cyclical. It followed the seasons of the year. And this, to my mind, is a support of this understanding here, that this world that we have, that we live in right now, is essentially different from prehistoric time, etc. So let's keep going. But the point is this amazing statement, that the fact that it says Vehine Tov Ma'od, and indeed it was very good, the sense of logic, right, of this particular interpretation doesn't make any sense. Im lo, if it's not for the fact Val pi haklal hanizkar, that general rule that was mentioned, meaning that the word hine, as the Rashbam understood the pshat of the vehine, to mean that up to that point, the halashon hine, that the expression of hine, more, it indicates al hitchadshut hadavar. It says something new was happening, something novel was happening, ma shelo haya adko, something that wasn't happening up until that moment. For imkain, and if this is the case, ha-perush, the understanding of this verse, vehine tov, right, where it says, behold, he saw it was good, shenitchadesh b'ha'olam davar shehu tov, that something new came into the world, something that was considered tov, ma shelo haya mitchila, something that was not the case before. By the way, the word tov also has a sense of completeness. Why? Because it's a very important rule that you don't judge a work while it's being done. You wait until something's finished before you can judge its value, right? You don't judge a work in progress. So, ba'af hacha, and so here too, be'inyan shelefanenu, in this matter that is before us, yitba'er gamken, it becomes clarified, right? Also, inyan drashaso, the way in which this interpretation works. Al pi klal se, according to this general rule, hine na yadati, that because it says hine, now I understand. Mashma, it implies, ach ata nodali, only now do I realize this. V'dok QED. V'sibat, and as to why, right? So it hadn't answered that question yet, but why? And the reason, ha'hakara ata, the reason why only now did he realize this, yesh lomar, one can say, al pi ma shekatuv ba'agadot, according to the legends, we have legends regarding that answer this question. She'avru banahar, they were crossing the river, v'ra'a bo paneha, and he saw in the river a reflection of her face. Ve'ein laha richod, and there's no need at this point to go any longer into this particular matter. We don't need to say any more about it for now. So that is this wonderful, wonderful Torah Tmima. I was very aware of the basic drush, but it wasn't until I read the Torah Tmima where he breaks it apart like this and looks carefully and says, well, wait a second, why? And to understand. And using the Rashbam, this Torah Tmima's amazing encyclopedic knowledge, to bring this together for us in this particular way. And that's going to be it for now. I'm going to stop the share. We're still recording. If you have any comments, I am all ears. Yes? No? Okay. We will go off air.